evil human experiment. Okay, guys, let's start calmly. In the 4th century BC, Greek civilization was making great strides. Curiosity about the world was increasing, and people were beginning to ask very significant questions. What does that do? Soup are salad. What are worms? Why are clouds? How big is a bear? Where's my dad? Why do kids love cinnamon toast? Are flip-flops? I get sometimes. What's faux dinner? All these questions are useful for those who want to understand how the natural world works. While many focused on the mechanics of the universe, others chose to study the inner workings of humans, and not just philosophically. Sometimes one simply wants to know what makes us move. That's what Greek doctor Syphilis aimed to discover and meticulously record. After completing his studies at the Hippocratic Medical School in Greece, Syphilis shifted his gaze towards Alexandria, Egypt, with its grand pulsating library, brimming with scrolls eagerly awaiting perusal. Off to Egypt it is, he declared, and off he went. Once settled and with a pupil under his wing, a young doctor named Eris, they embarked on their mission. Together, they would inaugurate a novel field of study, anatomy. However, to do so, one needs specimens to dissect and probe. And what better source for fresh cadavers than condemned criminals procured and supplied by the Alexandrian ruler? Little Hero and Ira were akin to children in a candy emporium, their eyes shimmering with hope and anticipation as they embarked on their extraordinary experiments. But were the criminals subjected to surgery already past their expiry date? Absolutely not. Instead, Hero and Ira conducted live dissections of humans, known as Vivisections, to enrich their understanding of the human body. They even went to the extent of performing these procedures openly for anyone intrigued by the novelty. Wow. That's both fascinating and captivating. Exactly, Syphilis meticulously recorded their observations, making groundbreaking revelations about human anatomy. In doing so, he inflicted indescribable agony on his subjects as anesthetics were virtually non-existent at the time. The victims experienced every incision and laceration until they succumbed to unconsciousness from the agony or perished due to hemorrhage. Exploring intestines, reproductive systems, ocular structures, or even deliberately impairing motor nerves to induce paralysis was akin to a significant inquiry into cause and effect, almost like playing a complex game of what does this button do? Ultimately, Hero and Ira's discoveries over for decades of vivisections were groundbreaking for the medical community, particularly as human dissection would soon be prohibited following the culmination of their research. It would not be until 1,800 years later that human dissections would regain acceptance in medical practice, albeit performed on deceased individuals. Their findings were housed within the esteemed Library of Alexandria, yet tragically lost in the devastating fire several centuries later. Project 4.1 was essentially a supplemental endeavor proposed shortly after the deployment of Castle Bravo, a high-yield thermonuclear bomb launched by the United States in 1954. Bravo was part of Operation Castle, a sequence of other high-yield nuclear tests aimed at asserting dominance over the Soviet Union. The Marshall Islands, a secluded group of Pacific atolls, served as the epicenter for the detonation of these nuclear weapons. Castle Bravo turned out to be the most potent explosion, unexpectedly yielding to 1.5 times the anticipated explosive force, equivalent to 15 megatons of TNT. To provide context, this is 1,000 times the explosive power of the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, in the waning days of World War II, absolutely mind-blowing. To compound matters, the Marshall Islands were inhabited by civilians, prompting U.S. officials to express concern.
Sir, shouldn't we evacuate those people from the...
Bless you.
Thanks, sir. Allergies have been bothering me all day. Must be the radiation, right? No, but seriously, are we going to evacuate those people from the radiation zone?
Yeah, that was on my agenda. Well, it's too late now, so let's just wait and see how things unfold.
Operation Castle underwent rapid modification with the incorporation of Project 4.1. This additional segment aimed to investigate the human reaction to substantial radiation exposure. As if the tens of thousands of victims in Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't evidence enough, Commander of the U.S. Naval Medical Corps, Eugene Cronett, led the project and imposed strict confidentiality on all involved because he believed the public wouldn't approve of the whole testing nuclear radiation on non-consenting people concept. In total, 239 Marshallese inhabitants were subjected to substantial levels of radiation and began exhibiting symptoms of radiation sickness a few days later. Symptoms include hair loss and severe skin damage with oozing wounds. Although the wounds healed relatively quickly, direct monitoring ceased after 75 days, concluding that no long-term effects were probable. However, out of sheer curiosity, routine checkups were conducted on the residents for years afterward. Women experienced an increase in miscarriages and stillbirths, while surviving newborns encountered developmental challenges, stunted growth, and a disproportionate incidence of thyroid cancer. Furthermore, approximately one-third of the exposed individuals had developed significant tumors by 1974, 2 decades after Operation Castle began. In the subsequent years, Marshallese representatives denounced the United States, alleging that the experiment's extent was premeditated and intentional, to which U.S. officials responded,
No.
During the initial years of the Soviet Union, it was not uncommon for political adversaries to swiftly succumb to a severe case of demise by poison. Indeed, it proved to be an effective and discreet method to silence any opposition without arousing significant attention, except for the occasional public reaction to mysterious deaths. And this is precisely why we must revolt against them. Oh, would you look at that? They've claimed another victim. So, how did the Soviets become so adept at concocting lethal poisons? Well, naturally, they conducted preliminary experiments on live subjects. Thus, in 1921, a year prior to the official formation of the Soviet Union, the Kamera was established. This served as the Soviet Secret Service's poison laboratory, where new deadly toxins were developed and trialed on human subjects. These subjects were often prisoners from the Gulag's various labor camps scattered across the nation, reserved for anyone harboring dissenting thoughts not endorsed by the Soviet regime.
Carry on.
The primary objective of the Kamera was to develop a poison that possessed lethal properties while remaining completely undetectable. It needed to be colorless, flavorless, scentless, and untraceable during post-mortem examinations. Prisoners were unwittingly subjected to various experimental toxins cleverly disguised as medication. Personally, if it doesn't resemble an orange Flintstone vitamin, I'm skeptical. The range of poisons tested encompassed ricin, inducing severe internal distress, and agony, cyanide, capable of inducing violent convulsions and heart failure, and curare, a potent muscle relaxant resulting in a painful asphyxiation. Ultimately, the experiments proved fruitful for the Soviet Union, albeit not for the unfortunate prisoners. The research yielded inventive methods to discreetly eliminate a target, ranging from dispersing cyanide as a mist to simulating an assassination as a heart attack. However, the standout creation was the compound known as ceticaramine choline chloride, essentially liquid despair. Exposure to this substance elicited a rather peculiar response. Instead of a dramatic "I've been poisoned" demise, the victim experienced a gradual weakening and rapid deterioration in health, all while maintaining a composed and silent demeanor. Death ensued within a mere 15 minutes. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russian authorities have asserted that the camera has been disbanded and abandoned. Yeah, right? You might have come across the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, an unethical medical research initiative funded by the United States Public Health Service in 1932. It involved studying approximately 400 African American men who had naturally contracted syphilis. The objective was to observe the untreated progression of the disease in African American males. Despite the widespread availability of penicillin, an effective treatment for syphilis, the affected men were intentionally left untreated. However, the U.S. took things up a notch with the Guatemalan syphilis experiment. Taking place between 1946 and 1948. This experiment involved over 5,500 Guatemalan natives, including children, who were subjected to the study without their consent. The Guatemalan government granted access to these unwilling participants in various institutions, such as hospitals, mental health facilities, and orphanages. Around 1,300 relatively healthy individuals, ranging from ages 10 to 72, were deliberately infected with syphilis and gonorrhea. Transmission occurred through direct bacterial contact into wounds or sexual transmission with infected native sex workers who were financially supported by the U.S. government. Interestingly, the latter method proved to be particularly effective in spreading the infection. Dr. John C. Cutler, the individual overseeing these experiments, earned the moniker Dr. Decasse. He frequently failed to maintain accurate medical records of his experiments, opting instead for anecdotal evidence in his reports, likely due to his awareness of the unethical nature of his actions, a characteristic befitting a Decasse. But setting aside jests, the experiments inflicted horrifying experiences on the participants. One of the most distressing documented instances involved a female patient named Berta. The following excerpt provides insight into her harrowing ordeal. Berta was a female patient in the psychiatric hospital. In February 1948, Berta was injected into her left arm with syphilis. A month later, she developed scabies. Several weeks later, Dr. Cutler noted that she had also developed red bumps where he had injected her arm, lesions on her arms and legs, and her skin was beginning to waste away from her body. Berta was not treated for syphilis until 3 months after her injection. Soon after, on August 23rd, Dr. Cutler wrote that Berta appeared as if she was going to die, but he did not specify why. That same day, he put gonorrheal pus from another male subject into both of Berta's eyes as well as her private areas. He also reinfected her with syphilis. Several days later, Berta's eyes were filled with pus from the gonorrhea, and she was bleeding from her private area. 3 days later, on August 27th, Berta died. I mentioned earlier that he had a rather unpleasant demeanor. The overall goal of the study was to determine the effectiveness of penicillin in preventing STDs. Dr. Cutler had allegedly finalized his reports in 1955, but no evidence was ever found proving that the reports were submitted for peer review or even published. So, out of all of that suffering, nothing of medical value was produced. Though I will say, in some glimmer of fairness, the treatment program was established by the United States and made available to the affected Guatemalan population. But only half were reported to actually have received treatments with a questionable quality of care. United States President Barack Obama formally apologized to the Guatemalan government in 2010, 62 years after the study was performed. The primary aim of the investigation was to evaluate the efficacy of penicillin in preventing sexually transmitted diseases. Dr. Cutler purportedly concluded his reports in 1955. However, no concrete evidence has emerged to confirm their submission for peer review or publication. Consequently, despite enduring significant suffering, the study failed to produce any medically significant outcomes. Nonetheless, it's worth mentioning that the United States initiated a treatment program for the affected Guatemalan community, albeit reports suggest that only half received treatment and the quality of care was questionable. In 2010, United States President Barack Obama issued a formal apology to the Guatemalan government, acknowledging the ethical breaches of the study 62 years after its execution. Well, that previous incident was quite shocking, wasn't it? Brace yourself because what follows is even more disturbing. Look at this. Unit 731. It was the site of some of the most infamous and truly atrocious war crimes committed by the Japanese during World War II, ranking among the worst atrocities in human history. Unit 731 functioned as a deadly laboratory for human experimentation and the development of biological weapons during the Second Sino-Japanese War, coinciding with much of World War II. This horrific facility was established in 1935 in the sub-provincial Chinese city of Harbin, following the Japanese invasion of the Chinese region of Manchuria 4 years prior. Inside its walls, hundreds of thousands of Chinese and even some Russian prisoners of war endured some of the most appalling and terrifying human experiments ever conducted. Men, women, and children were subjected to these experiments. Everyone. Those selected for experimentation were dehumanized and referred to as logs rather than as individuals, as Unit 731's cover story portrayed it as a lumber mill. It's worth mentioning that the vast majority of experiments conducted in the facility were driven by morbid curiosity, with those overseeing them described as merely playing. A testimony from a Japanese professor who witnessed these experiments stated, "Some of the experiments had nothing to do with advancing the capability of germ warfare or of medicine. That was just playing around. Professional people, too, like to play. There is such a thing as professional curiosity. What would happen if we did such and such? What medical purpose was served by performing and studying beheadings? None at all. So essentially, the experiments were like, what would happen if we threw a grenade at a guy? Ooh, oh, look, he exploded. Can I go home now? Hey, I wonder if this heavy object will crush this guy. Yeah, it did. Will this guy freeze to death if I freeze him to death? Well, surprise, he did. Many of these experiments were aimed at pushing the human body to its absolute limits. They involved depriving victims of food or water to observe their survival duration, subjecting them to low-pressure chambers until their eyes popped out, injecting them with animal blood, hanging them upside down until death, or draining them of blood to study blood loss limits. Some victims were dehydrated in front of large hot fans until they mummified. By the time of their death, they weighed only 20% of their initial body weight. One of the most disturbing instances I've encountered involved the coerced impregnation of women. These women were administered different diseases and medications to observe their effects on the fetus. At times, vivisections were conducted, involving the removal of the fetus from the mother for analysis. There are numerous other horrifying experiments that I cannot delve into here, but if you're interested, I suggest researching them. It's genuinely appalling. As the war neared its end and Soviet forces approached, Japanese authorities ordered the execution of all remaining prisoners and quickly demolished Unit 731 to eliminate any evidence of the program. The United States uncovered some traces of evidence and coerced Japanese officials into revealing information under the threat of being handed over to Soviet authorities for prosecution and punishment if they refused to cooperate. After learning the full extent of the atrocities committed at Unit 731, all those implicated were promptly brought to trial and executed for their crimes. However, contrary to expectations, they were not. The United States argued that the data obtained from these heinous acts was exceptionally valuable, as it could not have been obtained ethically through traditional means. Consequently, many involved individuals were granted immunity and released in exchange for this data. The agreement was made, and the United States kept all information confidential. In contrast, the Soviet Union pursued legal action against the top military leaders and scientists associated with Unit 731. Eventually, only 12 individuals faced trial and received sentences to serve several years in labor camps, despite the repeated denials by the United States regarding the existence of Unit 731. Well, that was disheartening. Here's something to lighten the mood. See you there.